Thank you for joining us today for this FPRI event. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Frank Gavin talking about his new book, Thinking Historically, A Guide to Statecraft and Strategy. Dr. Gavin is the Giovanni Angeli Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University, as well as director of the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. And we're excited to talk about your new book. And maybe just to get the conversation started, probably every question an author likes to be asked is, what is your book about and why did you decide to write it?
Well, Connor, it's really great to be here. And I have FPRI as a special place in my heart when I was at graduate school, getting a PhD at Penn. And when my wonderful friend and mentor, Wally McDougall, had an office there, I would go over and see him. And every once in a while, he would give me a stack of books and say, review these books. And so I've got incredibly fond feelings about it. And thank you for your question. There's a kind of a longer to shorter version of this, but essentially in the arc of my career, I've had the good fortune to both be trained as a historian, and I believe deeply in the mission of history, but for a variety of reasons, both fortunate, some less fortunate, I have the people that I've engaged with have been less the historical community and more in the academic community. It's sort of the international relations, public policy crowd. And I've also had the good fortune to engage with decision makers just because of some aspects of my career. And as a historian who believes deeply in the power of history to help us understand the present and the future, and being around training young, smart people who are going off to decision-making positions and believing that this way of understanding and knowing the world could provide some benefit, I decided to try to put my thoughts down on how they could do it. Because if you take an economics and microeconomics class or a game theory class or a beginning sociology class or an IR theory class, there's kind of a textbook version of what the epistemology is and how it can be applied. And for a variety of reasons, history doesn't have things like that, at least in as much abundance. And that's why I sort of produced it.
Yeah, I feel like your book is almost trying to tackle two problems. One problem being, the craft of policy making, but then the other problem, maybe problem isn't the right word, but how historians practice their craft and how they engage with their craft with policymakers or the larger audience. How did you think about those two issues? Am I framing it correctly?
No, that's very perceptive. That's very perceptive on your part, because as I started thinking about this and I would start looking for what books I became interested in to think about this, many of these had to do with the craft of history. Mark Bloch and the Historian's Craft, John Lewis Gaddis's brilliant The Landscape of History, E.H. Carr's What is History, and looking at the tradition of philosophy of history, historiography, and also being very influenced by Peter Novick's This Noble Dream, which I think was published in 1989, but was the history profession. And so how historians think about what they do, what they think they're doing, how they should do it, and how they relate to each other is a whole set of issues, which is very interesting. And I was sensitive to it because the subjects I study, war, statecraft, and strategy, are not looked on with great favor in the history discipline. So I wanted to kind of better understand some of that. And because the natural community that I found who is most interested in what I write and what I do outside of policymakers were not other historians. And so there was part of that was the identity crisis. What am I doing as a historian? What is the history discipline doing? Why is it that when I've been invited in the last month, I've been to Yale, Stanford, Princeton, a whole bunch of places, but never by any history departments, right? It's always by either international relations or policy schools. But so there is that. And that's a whole set of issues. And then on the flip side of that, they're not unrelated, is what I said earlier, that I had the pleasure to both train and also to interact with and teach with people who were seeking better ways to make difficult, consequential choices, facing radical uncertainty about the future. And as I thought about it, engaged with them more in teaching them and teaching with them, and hearing about their lives and careers, how they went about their jobs and what they did was more similar to some of the things that I thought myself and other historians did and were familiar with than some of the more what I call in the book muscular social sciences that focus on traits which have great benefits, generalizability, parsimony, falsifiability, replicability, but really actually don't reflect the life decision makers make. So you very perceptively picked up that there's two separate, and they're connected, and there's sometimes in tension, I can imagine. But I do think I also put a lot of, I mean, the dirty little secret that I think you figured out is that the obvious audience for this are people who are going to become decision makers. But I also think of myself, a younger version of myself as a historian, trying to figure out what is it I'm doing, how do I do it, why do I do it. So for that young historian, also hopefully there's something in there they can benefit from.
Yeah, I want to keep going down that route about history departments, historians, where the craft of history is going. I'm here at UT Austin, enmeshed in academia right now, and I see your book. As I was reading it, I was thinking a lot about Ernest May's book, Thinking in Time, and how historians used to be, I think, much more enmeshed in policy making. I'd love to hear your theory of, where history departments have gone, why they've gone that way. And we see it in academia, a big boom of these kind of civic institutions that are actually, trying to encourage a lot of historians to come into, you know, into the academy and be a little bit more practical. How do you see this landscape of your profession?
Yeah, great question. I will say you are at one of the greatest places, hook 'em. In terms of public-minded history, people like Mark Lawrence, Jeremy Surrey, Bill Brands. I mean, the guy who's running the university, Will Inboden, is a brilliant historian, gets these issues, and has written about the use of the history for policy, and it's just absolutely a fabulous scholar and academic leader. And everything they're doing with these civics institutes is very exciting. So it's a tricky question because I will say there's a couple problems when I talk about this. Those who don't know what's going on, unlike you and I, they're shocked or they don't believe it. Or like, well, of course, history departments must be studying these questions. What else would they be studying? Why wouldn't you study war, strategy, and statecraft? Wars and understanding their origins and their causes and their ends and consequences has affected all of humanity since time immemorial and drives all sorts of other subjects in social, cultural, artistic, economic, political, statecraft matters. And you just think about this and you say, well, of course they must be studying it. And you have to say, well, no, in fact, it isn't really studied to the extent you think it is. And to the extent it is, it's studied in a way that you might not recognize, right? It's studied, if you were to look at the kind of articles that are published, the kind of courses that are taught, you might be surprised. And you might say, I'm kind of surprised by that. And in fact, and then if you were going to go into the discipline, and this happens to me a lot, I'll get some people say, well, I really liked your book, but don't you think you were too hard in the history discipline? And my view is I wasn't hard enough, right? Like, I mean, and again, I didn't want the book to be about that. Hal Brands and I wrote a piece that caused a lot of people to get upset. I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, called The Slow Motion Suicide, Collective Suicide of the History Profession. And it was the one time I got history's attention because the president of the AHA had a response. And part of it had to do with my own interaction with the history department at Johns Hopkins, which is, I won't tell those stories. Maybe I can tell them to you over an adult beverage, but let's just say they were deeply frustrating. And if people recognize the lengths to which um, history departments will go to avoid engaging this kind of work, they'd be alarmed. So what is the reason? And I just have hypotheses for this. And there's some of them have to do with the problems in higher education, some have to do with the study of war and peace, some have to do with history in general. Writ large in universities, having spent some time at MIT and spent some time with nuclear engineers, I was involved in a search for a nuclear security person. It became apparent to me that in the harder sciences and in engineering, disciplines adapt according to problems, right? There's no nuclear engineering discipline. There's problems to be solved. So they will bring in a chemical, a sort of a organic chemist person, a physics person, material science person, a computational person to solve a problem. And if you look at MIT's engineering department, they're always spawning up new degrees, new programs, because the world changes. The social science, we have history, political science, anthropology, sociology, and economics and political science. And we got them more or less from the German model in the 1870s, my university, and we haven't changed. We haven't really added that much, and nor have the disciplines themselves changed. So there's a weird, which makes no sense given that the world is fundamentally different than 150 years ago. On the history field's decision not to study these things. There's some stuff in Noble Dream, the Novick book, but that's almost, 35 years out of date now. I think that there was a belief that when history departments were dominated by studying high politics and war and peace, they were overlooking other important topics. And there was something to that critique, right? And I think there's been this extraordinary expansion of the subjects and the periods and the perspectives that history has brought to the table, right? And I'm actually all in favor of that. And I think in terms of alerting policymakers to these different perspectives, that's absolutely crucial. But for whatever reason, people thought as they pursued these new perspectives, these new subjects, these new ways of understanding the world, they also decided to exclude these more traditional ways, thought of them as uninnovative, uninteresting. I think there's a political element to it too. There's almost this simplistic idea that if you study war, you must like war, which is nuts. Like we study war because war is this horrendous tragedy and we'd like to avoid it. We study international relations because it's hard and difficult, because we want to live in a better world for ourselves and our children. And the past is the best map we have to help guide us through all of this. But and the people who know this are undergraduates. So undergraduates don't care about disciplines. They care about the world. And so if they want to learn about why did the First World War happen? The First World War shapes our world to this day. The politics of the Middle East can't be understood. Russia, Ukraine can't be understood. China's sense of humiliation, the May 4th meeting mission and movement after Versailles, unless you understand the First World War. And students get that. But the final thing I'll say is that higher education has moved more and more and more towards specialization, smaller and smaller questions, because you achieve prominence in your field by dominating some small sub area that is of interest to you and maybe 14 other people. And so this is a way of flipping back to these civics institutions. There's a lot of politics behind it. I don't love everything about what's going on with them, but they do recognize that there are big questions out there that people are interested in having smart people reflect upon and use the power of the past to shed light on. No group more than smart undergraduates. And so I'm hopeful that they succeed. I'm not super confident that the history discipline will sort of see the enormous opportunity it has. I mean, again, if it could figured this out. Part of the argument of my book is that thinking historically and this epistemology provides unique, powerful insight to the world of critical decision making. And we all know, not just in statecraft, but in business and NGOs and international organizations, the idea of having that kind of set of tools and insights to improve decision making. Well, there's a massive audience for that. Why wouldn't you embrace that? And again, the discipline of history, for its own particular pathologies, has chosen not to.
Yeah, and let's get into some of the core concepts, and I'll tell our audience that we will have a Q&A section towards the end. So if you have any questions for Dr. Gavin, throw them in the chat. But you talk about historical sensibility and then thinking historically. So what are these concepts? How can people, policymakers, and historians use them? How did you come to define these?
Yeah. So historical sensibility is what I started with. And in the beginning, I used the two phrases, historical sensibility and thinking historically interchangeably. And I realized that wasn't right. Historical sensibility, any historian who delves into different periods, different cultures, different civilizations, different times, they develop a sort of temperament that I believe produces really admirable qualities. There's a certain curiosity, there's a certain sense of intellectual humility and modesty. There's a sense of recognizing the importance of perspective, that things that you take so for granted about how the world works and how to view the world is not necessarily how the world was viewed 2 or 3 generations ago. And it was certainly may not be the way the world is viewed in other parts of the world. And it's the same experience that you have when you first travel to other countries. And these vistas are opened up, and all of a sudden, that incredible sensation, that curiosity, it develops a toleration too for difference and a love of diversity, a love of the distinction and difference that is the human experience, while also understanding the common humanity that holds people together. And my strong belief is this temperament, this sensibility is extraordinarily humane. And it's one that understands perspective. It's one that's tolerant. It's one that's empathetic with the incredible challenges people face. A historian, at least in theory, when they go to the past and look at how people navigated their own worlds, you try to imagine how hard it would be not knowing what the future holds. So there was a sensibility. But as I thought about it, I said, my book is for people making decisions. And I tried to imagine you had a 15-minute meeting with a principal, a sort of deputy secretary of state or deputy defense Pentagon official, or maybe a foreign ministry somewhere else, or a national security advisor. And there was somebody, you had a historian, and then you had somebody from one of the more muscular disciplines, let's say an international relations theorist. And they're talking about a problem. The international relations theorist says, this is my theory that explains exactly what's happening. Here's 5 cases in the past. 4 times it came out this way. These are the 2 arguments against it. This is why they're wrong. And here is why why you should do this in the case you're facing. And the historian is losing their mind because they're like, this person's getting the history all wrong. There's circumstance, there's context, there's contingency, there's chance. Maybe the person that is talking about the origin of the First World War or Vietnam or whatever, or the Peloponnesian War. And and by the time it gets to be that person's turn to talk, the historian is so discombobulated and they find themselves arguing and just flabbergasted. And I realized that human beings, particularly in high pressure decision-making situations, just like anybody, they're going to crave certainty. So the famous Isaiah Berlin, riffing on Tolstoy, riffing on an ancient Greek philosopher about the difference between the fox and the hedgehog, right? Historians are largely foxes. They know lots of different things about lots of different things. Hedgehog knows one thing that explains everything. And in that meeting, the hedgehog has all the advantage. And a policymaker is going to say, what's a temperament? What's a sensibility? What am I supposed to do with this? Right? I have to make choices. And the other interesting thing that happens with the sensibility is you become overwhelmed with, perspective, circumstance, all this stuff. And you can get what I call historical vertigo, where you're kind of paralyzed. You can't make choices. And to not make a choice in policy is to make a choice. So I thought there has to be a second step, which is thinking historically, a set of particular insights and skills that should be applicable when a policymaker faces a challenge that they can use and apply. And so the way I think about it is all historians, serious historians, develop a historical sensibility, but they don't necessarily think historically. But you can't think historically effectively without the historical sensibility. And so I divided it up, and I'm grateful. This great friend Janice Stein is the dean of the Monk School, who was the first to say, you're talking about two different things here. You've got to really divide them up. And as I did that, it became far more clear what was a sensibility, which people have written about. Gordon Wood has great stuff on this, but to actually build upon that sensibility to say, okay, now here's in that 15 minutes with that decision maker, how you would go about helping them.
Is thinking historically, you set up that scenario, right, between the historian and the IR theorist, and it paints a great picture. I can 100% see it. Is this a push or inadvertently a push to make history more of a social science? Is this, because I agree, I do think sometimes history and historians, sometimes I come away being like, okay, what's the so what of it that I'll get from, social scientists and IR theorists, even though I don't know if I necessarily agree with their conclusions. So does this mean that history should become more social sciencey? Does it mean it needs to stay in the humanities, but work more? How do you see that?
Yeah, another great question. And I will say, in my own background, I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and a research assistant for John Mearsheimer years and years ago. And nobody thinks more clearly and sharply than John. And then when I studied at Penn, it was both with Wally, but also Mark Trachtenberg, who is a historian who's, deeply engaged in the kind of IR theory world. And because of the topics that I dealt with, both international monetary relations and nuclear strategy and nuclear proliferation, the people I was learning from and arguing with were more likely in that world. So I came to admire the way they went about the work, even as I disagreed about it. So, to your point, the so what question, right? Like, why am I studying this? Why do I care about this? The past is infinite. Why do we choose to? History as a discipline doesn't have a mechanism for answering this. Most people in the outside world say there's a common sense answer. What is most consequential? What is most interesting? What is most relevant? What is most important? And so on a regular basis, social science, the harder social sciences ask themselves that. Historians rarely do. How are you going to answer a question once you've developed it? What's your research design? What is your theory of agency and causality in the world? Again, which matters because if you're going to influence policy, policy is all about shaping outcomes in the world, but you can only do that if you have a theory for what creates outcomes in the world. And history doesn't do that. Now, but I'm going to resist saying it should be more like the others. So the things that drive probably you and I and others crazy about history is one of its hidden strengths. So the way I tell the story is when I was an undergraduate at University of Chicago, even though I was an IR major, if you took history, Chicago had 4 colleges: physical sciences, biological sciences, humanities, and social sciences. All majors were in a college, except one, which was history, which was in 2 colleges. It was in the College of Humanities and the College of Social Sciences. And the only difference was if you took it in the social sciences, you had a year of statistics in replacement for one of the languages. And for me, that highlights the identity crisis that history has, but that can be a positive thing. We live in a world right now where we are obsessed with sort of counting and measuring things. We're obsessed with data. We're obsessed with aggregating that data, treating them through algorithms or scientific methods, and coming up with outcomes. But I think we're in a world right now where some of the phenomena that are most important, be it rage, humiliation, resentment, honor, fear, how do you measure those? What is the data that indicates those? And the way I like to think about it is Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War says war can cause by interest, fear, or honor. And most of those muscular social sciences are really good at interest, right? But life is not an indifference curve, and we're living in it. We live in an era where we've generated more wealth than anyone can imagine, more information than anyone can imagine, generated unbelievable technological progress, doubled life expectancy. It's more secure for human beings personally walking down the street and against sort of war and war and pillaging. Yet we're absolutely miserable, and we have this sense of anxiety. How do you measure that? Do you really want an economist, or do you want a historian thinking about that? And so that ability to deal with subjects that are hard to measure, that are hard to collate, that are hard to run algorithms on, and that are frankly interpretive, right? Like there's no way around that. Um, but historians, through that historical sensibility, can shed light on that in a way that's harder even for a sociologist to do, where it has more of that humanities kind of feel. And given the sort of set of issues that we face today, they seem to me often less material than teleological anyway, and that historical direction, meaning, and purpose. And so I think historians, that diversity, that kind of that almost jelly-like ability to kind of transform, while it can be frustrating, also provides some unique powers in this current moment.
Yeah. And so let's talk about how to apply history to policymaking, because I do think that policymakers do like historical analogy, but I almost feel like in political conversations, something is either Munich or something is Vietnam. And that's what, the two different sides will go to. So how can policymakers spot bad use of history and good use of history?
Yeah, another really perceptive question. So you had mentioned earlier Ernest May and Dick Neustadt's Thinking in Time, which was written in 1986 and was based on a course they taught at Harvard, and it's a course that existed in various forms even after they left. Fred Logevall teaches an excellent version of it now called Reasoning from History. But the textbook itself is kind of interesting. And if you put a gun in my head, I would say the book is less about using history and more about navigating bureaucracies and understanding complex bureaucracies. I think the problem that Neustadt was always fascinated with, and May was as well, particularly as they both were on the periphery of Cold War decision making, and especially as they both ended up at Harvard after the Vietnam War, trying to understand how did the US government end up doing something so disastrous. And one of the things they settled upon was what you mentioned, was the misuse of analogies. And there's something to that, and that's important. May and Neustadt have my favorite line about why you should teach history to policymakers, because they say it's like teaching sex education to teenagers. You can't tell them not to have sex, but if they're going to do it, they ought to do it safely and with some enjoyment. And it's to your point that everyone uses history, they just use it poorly. Um, and there's a couple elements to this. Part of it is because our brains are wired. We tell causal stories about ourselves all the time. If you haven't had this experience, you will. Every historian has found themselves either going home to visit their family, lots of relatives or a cocktail party, and someone says, what do you do? And you explain. And they just use that as an excuse to give their view of General Patton or their favorite president or their political issue, because they think no special skill is needed to do it. You know, no neurosurgeon goes to a cocktail party and some random person says, I've had some great ideas about that I'd like to apply in neurosurgery. Or no airplane designer goes out and says, you know what I'd really like to do when I design an airplane. But with historians, and my contention is that doing really good history is harder than neurosurgery or designing aircraft, right? You know, people look at me like I'm crazy, but I have no doubt that that's true. But everyone thinks they do it, so they think there's no particular expertise in it. Also, because of what I mentioned to be a virtue of history, it's sort of undefined, lack of a core sort of set of curriculum. It means that it's very hard to judge what's good or bad history. And then finally, we can't let historians or history departments decide what's good or bad history because they've done such a bad job of that over the last 30, 40 years. So into that vacuum, you have all sorts of dilettantes, or you have the bad misuse of history. And it's one of the key things that I think is important about thinking historically is being able to identify when it's being done poorly. Then even when it's being done well, to understand it's still going to be problematic. So the book I like better of May's is Lessons of the Past, and he wrote it in 1973. And he deals with the analogy thing there. And he says everyone using the Munich analogy to describe Vietnam and how that was unfortunate and that was a mistake. And it's very powerful. But in that same book, he also does two things that are interesting. One, he makes it very clear that the Korean War, America's intervention in Korea, was a mistake. And the second thing he does is he predicts from 1973 that in the next 10 years, the one prediction he can make is that the Cold War will soften and calm down and not become more tense. Well, that turned out to be wrong. And if you were to ask even May in 1993, was America's intervention in the Korean War a bad thing? Well, the Cold War turned out in a way he didn't expect. And America's intervention in the Korean War, which seemed unpleasant and tragic and wasteful and left Truman as the most unpopular president in recorded polling history, in the long run, probably turned out to be essential. So this highlights that, of course, when you ask the question matters quite a bit. And so when I was thinking about the analogy question, May and Neustadt are very good about saying people grab the analogy from the past and move it to the present. And they often do that incorrectly. Like Vietnam's obviously not Munich, or, you know, you can imagine the other ones with its Cuban Missile Crisis or the Peloponnesian War. But what struck me is when people, even when they critique the current use of an analogy, they didn't recognize that actually we're not sure what actually happened in the past. And that's open, right? Like there are interpretations of Munich that are different than people expect. If you use the July crisis, July 1914 crisis as your analogy, or the Great Depression analogy, we often act like that's fixed, but in fact it's not. And so in the book, I spend a lot of time looking at something we think is fixed, the Cold War, because in Washington and other places, people keep talking about, are we in a second Cold War, Cold War II? And the debate is usually structured around today is similar to the Cold War in these ways, or today is dissimilar. And what I try to do is say, you have no idea what the Cold War is. And I ask 5 simple questions and I show how there's a variety of interpretations of what the Cold War is. And I talk about a simple question of when did it begin? You know, Trachtenberg really thinks it began in 49-50. Most historians believe it began somewhere in 46, 47. David Engerman and Mel Leffler started in 1917. Arnie Westad, one of our most prestigious Cold War historians, dates it in the late 19th century. Other historians like Danny Bessner or Steve Wertheim say the Cold War is not really the thing you should be focusing on. It's all about what America was doing. The Cold War is sort of not the thing that matters. And my colleague Sergei Rodchenko says something similar about the Soviet Union. And so what that does is, and this is the part where you go from the historical sensibility to thinking historically, it complicates everything. It kind of scatters everything. But then you realize as you try to rebuild and recognize in your own arguments that you're making, that each of those arguments for when that began holds within it theories of agency and causality in the world. What matters, who or what matters, why it matters. Because if you're going to do policy, if you believe that the Cold War began in 1917, you believe ideology is something that really matters. Or, to take the simple example, Ben Stell has this great book about Henry Wallace. And in the summer of 1944, FDR wanted to get Henry Wallace off the ticket. But FDR hated confrontation, and he hemmed and he hawed, and he sent Wallace on some wild global mission. And he came very close to not kicking him off at the convention, which FDR didn't even go to. Both Truman and Henry Wallace apparently thought they were the vice presidential candidate. So imagine a world where FDR doesn't get around to getting Wallace off the ticket or somehow, and then Wallace is president in the spring of 1945. The question of how different the world would have been reflects what you think matters. If you believe structure matters, you might say that, it would have mattered at the edges, but not really that much. Do you think ideology is a great driver? If it began in 1917, it was baked in, or 1880, you might not think it matters. If you think individual decision making is the key part of what shapes outcomes in the world, you'll think it matters enormously. But those going back and interrogating that then forces you to say, what in this current moment do you think matters? Because if you're going to make policy, you have to have a theory about where you're going to intervene and change and what is possible. And so that's what I do there with the historical analogy aspect.
So, what are some cases, or maybe a case, where you think policy would have been different had policymakers or advisors had adopted this thinking historically method?
So, just a caveat before I go into that. I think I have no way of proving this. I think that decision making in most foreign policy situations is very, very hard. Henry Kissinger always referred to them as 51-49 situations. And I believe that you would end up maybe getting them to 52-48 or 53-47. But I also think an understated benefit and value is the ability to recognize when you've made a bad decision, to avoid the sunk cost fallacy and sort of get out. So I'm just going to preface that. But I will say one of the reasons I wrote this book is that when I was at a PhD, and then I got hired and recruited to the LBJ school at the University of Texas. And I was hired as a presidential historian. There's a whole hilarious story. I'm not a presidential historian, but why I got hired there. It had to do with the LBJ tapes being released and everybody saying, we need a historian. And so I get there and I'm like, what can I teach? And it wasn't obvious what I could teach because it was, my colleagues were, they worked on local transportation and municipal bonds and state regulations and education and local health issues. So there were economists and public policy people and political scientists here and there. So we had a course called policy development. I decided to teach that. And it was the fall of 2000. And I decided the way I would teach this is I would have them do two case studies from 1945 on. One which involved what I considered a success, American policy on the German question, and one which I saw as a disaster, which was America's policy in Southeast Asia. And I would have them end up with a simulation in what Fred Logevall calls a long 1964, where we'd have a bunch of people try to see if they could get a different outcome than what had happened when President Johnson escalated. And you'd have someone play George Ball, someone play Dean Russ, someone play, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they would go to the LBJ libraries, look at the documents, and prepare. And it was this great exercise. And we had a really, really good time. So I taught it again in the second semester, and it highlighted the tragedy of this war in Vietnam. And so at the end of that second semester, I said, and I wrote in my notes, well, at least we don't have to worry about this happening again. Of course, a few months later, tragic Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States on September 11th, and the US launching the global war on terror, which included, I think it's fair to say, disastrous military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I remember at the time thinking to myself that, this is not good. Like, we should have a conversation about what we should be doing. And the thing that worried me most, it's not necessarily that you would have come up with a better set of decisions if you had participated in this class, had read the documents, had read Logoval's book. But what bothered me about the debate at the time was everyone was acting like the world was transformed. It was a new day. There was nothing from the past we could learn. This was day zero, right? And for any historian, that immediately gets your antenna up and says, sometimes there are new things, but is this the new thing? And is there literally nothing about the lessons of history? I mean, what is the lesson of Vietnam? No matter how powerful you are, trying to defend, to overthrow a government and install a friendlier government, thousands of miles away in the face of deep resistance isn't a great idea and rarely works out, no matter how good your intentions are. Now, maybe this would be the case where it's different, but at least acting like wrestling with that could be, I thought, beneficial. So that, because I remember clearly thinking after 9/11, we were engaging in a series of decisions that I thought were mistakes, but even if I didn't think they were mistakes, I didn't like how the debate was structured. And people felt like we were in this new world. And it was, every world is a new world. Every day, everyone thinks they live in the most unique times. And so I think a lot of the tragic missteps could have been avoided with a more vigorous wrestling with history.
Yeah, and that might be a good opportunity to pull in one of our Q&A questions. One of our audience member asks, how should policymakers discern their approach in applying history to unprecedented emerging issues? We're talking about AI, space, cyber domains, where there isn't as much of a strong historical precedent for it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And on my checklist, because as you know, in the book, I have this 12 questions that people should ask. One of them is this unprecedented? And this is a tricky thing for a historian to say, but there are times where we can be misled by being too engaged in the past. Things do change. For example, in this last century, we've doubled life expectancy. We've increased the availability of food, 15-fold. Demographic patterns have shifted enormously. And cheap food, fuel, housing, and the decreased salience of land versus ideas and innovations are all unbelievably important factors. All right. And so, and I think about this when I think about Russia's catastrophic invasion of Ukraine, which is obviously terrible and criminal, but it's also stupid, right? Because you say to yourself, if you're Russia, what does the Donbass have? It has wheat, coal, and a lot of people. In 1905, wheat, coal, and a supplicant population is a form of power. Nobody thinks wheat and coal is a form of power, and it's not a supplicant population. In 1905, nobody cared if you did these things in the age of imperialism. In 2022, people cared enormously. So even if they had won, they would have lost, right? It's just, and it showed their inability to recognize profound changes in history, right? And so to the question about things like emerging technology, this is something I wrestle with all the time. Um, and I think it's a great debate to have because on the one hand, the historian in me is always like, well, we had the printing press and literacy, the Gutenberg Bible, and we also had electrification, and that, we've had general purpose technologies. On the other, the extent to which in my lifetime digital revolution had penetrated every aspect of life from about, say, the mid 1970s on, accelerating in the mid to late 1990s, and now about to take another step order function through AI, I think in some ways is changing some of the basic parameters of things, and there aren't useful analogies from the past. And like, does electrification, which is to me the closest general purpose technology, which did transform life, will it do things like change consciousness? Will it change a sense of who we are? I think that's a big debate to have, but the questioner is asking a very important question. And I think that's why it's on the checklist. Is it unprecedented? There might be elements of it that are, elements that are not, but sometimes new things do happen, and it's important to recognize it.
Do you think, the government, Washington, should formally incorporate historians into the government? There's a passing reference to, I think it was Graham Allison's idea of a council of historians. The current government is forming their National Security Council strategy, defense strategy. How formal do you think historians should be incorporated into the government, and incorporating that historical sensibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think Graham and Neal's piece was very important, generated a great amount of attention. I'm huge fans of what they've done for applied history. But my caution would be this. I think those kind of proposals make historians luxury items, like the amuse-bouche, and what I believe is that anyone, step back a bit. My dean, longtime friend Jim Steinberg, and I created a program, one of these Bridging the Gap programs called the International Policy Scholars Consortium and Network. And the idea was to help smart PhD students in history or IR contribute more, engage more, be more attached to sort of decision-making debates. And the theory was, it just seemed odd that the training to become national security advisor was to go to Yale Law School. Jim's a Yale Law School grad, and he said, I didn't learn anything at Yale Law School. Or I did, it's not really the training. And in his mind, having a deep appreciation and understanding of history is far and away the most important. He would add political theory, sociology, anthropology, some economics, some political science, some, understanding of technology. But at heart, a historical sensibility and thinking historically, another great thing about history is can be very promiscuous about using and pulling in other disciplines and bodies of knowledge. So my preference would be, I mean, Kissinger, even though he got his PhD in the government department, considered himself a historian. Zabig was kind of more in the political science world, even though they're in the same department. But I think a world that saw people regularly say, well, I can't get an MBA degree without several courses in historical reasoning, right? And Harvard, with its business, international government, and economics program and its development of case studies under Arthur Chandler and Tom McGraw, had some sense of this. Or, a recognition that almost every pursuit is historical at some point. If you're a doctor and you're trying to diagnose a patient, you're undertaking history, right? Most science has a historical element to it. And so people should learn at least the basics of how to do it well. And so I think any citizen, I think our politics would be a lot more productive if this historical sensibility was more kind of pervasive. But I also think there are few activities that aren't historical in nature, or that thinking historically wouldn't apply on. So what I would like to see is that training be part everywhere, right? You don't become a doctor unless you take a historical reasoning class, a medical doctor. You don't become an ecologist because everyone's creating causal stories. Nobody does that with more reflection than historians. So that's how I would think about it. My ambitions are actually a bit more expansive and broader even than having a council of applied historians.
As we wait for those historical reasoning courses to diffuse, what are some attributes or skills that you learned in your history profession that you think individuals can cultivate to develop a more historical mind?
Yeah, it's like I'll give you a very basic example, and it's the Kissinger example. As you probably know, Henry was beloved in China. And there's a lot of people who say kind of smarmy things about why that is. But if you look at the historical records of what Kissinger's first visits to China were like, he didn't go there and lecture them. He basically asked them questions. Tell me about how you see the world. Tell me about how you understand history. Tell me about how you see us. These are kind of the kind of questions historians like to ask. There's a certain curiosity. And it doesn't mean he agreed with them, but when they said, this is how we see our place in the world, this is how we see you, this is what matters to us, this is what we're afraid of, uh, it the fact that somebody asked them that immediately drew them to them. So there's an instrumental purpose to that historical curiosity. It also arms you because you now understand what your interlocutor thinks about the world. So if instead you go over and say, why are you doing this, that, and the other thing? Or we're mad about this, that, and the other thing. Or you're being irrational. Or you're breaking international law. Or you're breaking our notion of what's right and wrong. You may believe that. But how many times in life has someone come up to you and say, you know what, Connor, I think you're doing it all wrong. And this is the reason why, that you're like super interested in continuing that conversation. So great diplomacy, there's other people like Bill Burns is really good at this, and he has a DPhil, I believe, in history from Oxford, of asking questions that reflect that different people, different societies have different perspectives. They may have different time horizons. They may have different notions of values and what matters. And you don't have to agree with them. It doesn't have to all be relative. But if you're going to be effective, you might say, well, we disagree with your view that Taiwan's always belonged to you, but let's kind of put that aside. What do we agree upon? Or why can you understand why we have a problem with this? And maybe we can't resolve this dispute. Maybe it's irresolvable. But at the very least, you will understand what their motivation is, and maybe they'll understand you. And that's kind of a basic thing that historical sensibility you get right from the beginning, asking questions, curiosity, seeing things where others don't. I use an image in the book where I said, a historical sensibility is like a magnet, and it can pull out from underneath the surface all sorts of things that are sort of hidden, right? Like, the powerful magnet that draws out people, places, events, phenomena that you might not have otherwise seen because they're beneath the surface. And then thinking historically is like a chemical dye where you take a vast amount of information and you identify what actually matters. And that's sort of thinking about it, drawing in from the unexpected and adding the chemical dye to get quickly to what matters is, to me, sort of the best visualization of what I think historians can do when it comes to decision making.
We're almost at time, but my final question, and probably a question every historian could probably go on for hours with, is book recommendations. What would you recommend to our listeners here if they wanted to either get a better idea of how to, think historically, or good examples of historical writing and analysis that you think is worthy of some of our listeners to spend their time on?
Sure. Well, given that you're at FPRI, I'm going to give a shout out to my dissertation committee at Penn back in the day who wrote brilliant books. Wally McDougall's written a bunch of great books, but Promised Land, Crusader State is the best book on the history of American foreign relations out there. Mark Trachtenberg's A Constructed Peace, which is the best book on understanding the Cold War in Europe. And Bruce Kuklick, who's an intellectual historian, wrote a book called Blind Oracles, Intellectuals in War, 1945 to 1975, that had an enormous impact on how I think about this. He would disagree with much of what I'm saying in this book, but I've learned so much from him. Leaving the Penn orbit, I'm a big fan of William McNeill and his work, Pursuit of Power. I like big, I go back and forth between the sort of micro histories that explain the sort of minute to minute to those that are kind of these big sweeping ones. Like Jeffrey Parker has a tremendous book on the disaster that was the 17th century. But William McNeill's Pursuit of Power, which I always pair together with Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Um, uh, Christopher Clark is somebody I love, and his Sleepwalkers is a book I go back and read again and again. In terms of biography, I really love Steve Kotkin's books on Stalin. Adam Tooze's, one of the great international historians, his book, The Deluge, on the interwar period is terrific. There's a great book now, and I'm going to forget its title. I just finished, and I got a bunch of people to read. It's by Perry Anderson, who's this new left Marxist guy, but he wrote a book about the historians who wrote about the origins of the First World War. And he talks about Albertini, who I loved, and Fritz Fischer, and Chris Clark, and a variety of other people. And it's sort of your classic historiography sort of thing. I can't, the title's going to elude me, but he got me then reading a bunch of his other stuff. So, I could go on and on and on, but those are a few recommendations.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to end, and I think you've just added a few more books to my reading list already. But I want to thank you, Dr. Gavin, for joining us today and talking about your new book, Thinking Historically. I also want to thank all of our guests who joined us for the conversation, as well as our supporters at FPRI. For those listening, if you're interested in learning more about FPRI and our work, you can go to fpri.org. But thank you again, Dr. Gavin, and appreciate you coming on and talking to us.
Thank you, Connor. This was a lot of fun.